we work through this legislation. It's a good piece of legislation that is a good step and a good measure amongst many that this national government are bringing to deal with this problem.
Speaker.
Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, it is a pleasure to rise and speak to the Social Housing Reform, Restructuring and Tenancy Matters Amendment Bill, only so in order to actually put the position of the New Zealand Labour Party, which has had a very long, strong track record of actually developing and improving our social housing in New Zealand. And just to place on record that it's every single time that it's the national government that actually starts to undermine the fabric of our really important housing sector. And, Mr Speaker, I do want to draw a bit of an analogy around some things that have happened in the past that are a little similar to this, because it is a warning that I want to make sure that people hear. It's related to the history of things that were once state-provided, then becoming run by very well-meaning non-government organisations, very well-meaning but under-resourced non-government organisations, then ending up in private hands. And the example that I want to share with the New Zealand public when we think about this issue is actually what's happened in the rest home sector in the last 25 years. Because, Mr Speaker, once upon a time, right here in New Zealand, rest homes were by and large owned and operated by the state. That's right. It was actually the government that actually owned and operated those important institutions that take care of our some of the most vulnerable in our society. And at a point in time, I think it was probably in the 1980s that this started, very well-meaning non-government organisations, mainly religious and welfare organisations, put their hands up and said, we'd like to be involved in providing that care. And the government of the day said, that's great, we will gift you pretty much, without any cost to you, the buildings, these rest home buildings, as long as you run the services. We're going to give that over to you. And, Mr Speaker, that seemed like an entirely reasonable and rational thing to do at the time, although some of us protested it at that stage. But what happened next was what some of us had predicted for some time, and that was that these very well-meaning organisations actually didn't have the capability and the capacity to actually do the job in the way they really wanted to. So because they are religious and welfare organisations, they really wanted to take care of the vulnerable and the elderly to a very high standard. And when they found that they weren't able to do that, then many of them actually got out of providing rest home care. And what does that mean? It meant selling to the private sector. And so in a very short period of time, Mr Speaker, we had, once upon a time, state-owned and state-operated rest home facilities change hands to become almost entirely privatised. And that's the state of that sector today. So why am I talking about that with regard to this piece of legislation? I'm talking about it, well, Simon Bridges can't understand the analogy. I'm just going to join the dots for Mr Bridges now, because that's exactly one of the things that's been proposed in this piece of legislation. Because what's been proposed is that Housing New Zealand properties can actually become now transferred into the NGO sector, and that seems like a very that might work very, very well. And I know that those organisations had the best interests of their community at heart, but they also did when they started owning and operating rest homes, and yet they found that over a period of time they couldn't sustain it in a way that they wanted to. Here's my prediction. I made a few predictions yesterday in the Melbourne Cup and they didn't come true. I hope that these ones may not as well. But my prediction is this, that these same organisations will struggle to provide social housing to a standard that they actually feel good about, and that could mean that this housing, this social housing, ends up in the hands of developers. In fact, I've been pointing out exactly this recently in Hamilton, where the Hamilton City Council have basically sold, not actually gifted, but sold pensioner housing, once owned and operated by the ratepayer, to a good non-government organisation, very good community sector. And my concern has been, because I would actually support that if it was adding to the housing stock. But what I'm really opposed to is when we have housing stock that already exists passing hands from being taxpayer owned and operated to the third sector and eventually ending up in private hands. That, Mr Speaker, is a pathway to the privatisation of our important assets, but more importantly, it is the handing on of these really important community commodities that help keep vulnerable people safe and healthy in our community into the hands of corporates. And there's never a good result when that happens. Mr Speaker, the other reason why Labor is opposing this bill is that the bill will extend reviewable tenancies, which will see 3,000 people kicked out of their homes in the next 3 years. 3,000 people. Despite the government's promise that this would not apply to elderly or disabled New Zealanders. But, Mr Speaker, how are they going to ensure that that's not going to happen? Because I can't see in this piece of legislation how they can make sure that that is not going to happen for those 3,000 people. How are they going to ensure that those people are not going to be elderly or disabled New Zealanders? I don't believe the bill addresses that at all. So while this bill is good in parts, Labor cannot vote for a bill that will see senior citizens ejected from their homes. We cannot support a bill that will see some of the most vulnerable in our society ejected from their homes. Provisions to extend reviewable tenancies to all tenants will create needless stress, needless anxiety and suffering for older New Zealanders who are the people who least deserve such treatment and are less able to cope with it. We've seen no evidence that the government has considered the likely health and social impacts of this provision. Tenants in social housing are an extremely vulnerable group who need a well-run social housing sector. A well-run social housing sector creates benefits for all New Zealanders as we see the costs of homelessness and poverty on society reduced. But, Mr Speaker, that is actually something that a government should hold itself responsible for. And certainly we here on the opposition benches are absolutely determined to hold the government accountable for ensuring that they look after the most vulnerable in our society. But sadly, what we see, and this bill will contribute to it, is the gap widening in New Zealand between the haves and the don't-haves. The inequalities on a day-by-day basis are increasing in New Zealand, and it's through policies like this that those inequalities are increasing. The government seems to be in denial that there's even a housing crisis in parts of New Zealand. They don't seem to take this issue seriously. We had the Minister of Housing, Nick Smith, on his feet today in question time, saying, what housing crisis? Actually, he said there's more houses being built than ever before. Never mind that most of them are replacing homes that have been wrecked by an earthquake, homes that don't actually add anything to the housing stock in New Zealand at all. They're simply replacing homes that were wrecked in a natural disaster. So here we have a government whose head is in the sand about the housing crisis. Their head is in the sand about the needs of some of the most vulnerable New Zealanders in our community, and they have come up yet again with a bill that falls well short and in fact has some very dangerous elements in it that could well make matters worse. Mr Speaker, I'm proud to be part of the Labor Party opposing this bill.
Mr Speaker.
Louise Upston.
Mr Speaker, the member that's just resumed her seat has clearly misunderstood the clear intent of this piece of legislation and the fact that she talks about the potential for 3,000 people to be removed from their house. Well, the fact of the matter is, these are state houses that are funded by taxpayers, and it's this side of the government, it is this side of the House that is tackling the real issue of making sure that people who are the most vulnerable in our community have the right size house in the right place in the right condition, which is more than that side of the House ever did. Mr Speaker, I'm proud to support this bill.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour. Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
7 votes opposed.
Māori Party.
2 votes in favour.
Mana.
1 vote opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Brendan Horan.
1 vote opposed.
Any other votes?
Ayes are 63, noes 56. The motion is agreed to.
Social Housing Reform, Housing Restructuring and Tenancy Matters Amendment Bill, second reading.
This bill is set down for committee stage next sitting day, and we call now on Government Order of the Day number 3.
Interrupted debate on the second reading of the Insolvency Practitioners Bill.